Okay, so welcome everybody to Kilmainham Gaol's Dublin Festival of History event. My name is Brian Crowley. I'm going to be giving the lecture this evening. I am the Curator of Collections here in Kilmainham Gaol Museum. I also look after the collection of the Pearse Museum on behalf of the Office of Public Works. So I suppose we'll get going. So I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see that. If you can't, let us know in the chat. Yes, so the subject of tonight's talk is Countess Markievicz's prison prayer book, which is an object that's been in the collection here in Kilmainham Gaol almost since the beginning of Kilmainham Gaol Museum. It came to the museum back in 1963. And I suppose the thing that prompted this talk and the reason that we're doing it this year is it's currently featuring in our centenary exhibition for 2021 on the Forgotten 10, which is the story of 10 men who were executed in Mountjoy prison during the War of Independence, and that opened back in June. Even though we were closed, we still were opening exhibitions, and it's due to run for the rest of the year. And Countess Markievicz's prison prayer book features in that exhibition. You can see it here. Because it contains two notes, one from Patrick Moran, the other from Thomas Whelan, both of whom were executed on the 14th of March 1921, both of whom were part of the group known as the Forgotten 10. And for years it's been on display in that context. It was, when we don't have an exhibition on the Forgotten 10, we do have a dedicated exhibition case all about them, and this is one of the the key objects that's on in that display usually. So in many ways the prayer book is interpreted through its association with those two men. Now normally I suppose this would be an opportunity to talk about the idea of kind of women's history kind of subsumed to that of men, but actually Countess Markievicz features quite heavily throughout the permanent exhibition in Kilmainham Gaol. But I suppose what's interesting about it is that we've generally seen the prayer book in that context. Also, it's been on display in an exhibition case, which kind of limits our opportunity to, I suppose, take a deeper look at it. But over lockdown, the prayer book was actually off display because we were preparing for this exhibition, and it kind of prompted me to have a proper look at it again. It would have been catalogued in the 1990s, and again, when it was catalogued back in the 1990s, our cataloging system would have been much less, I suppose, sophisticated than the one we have now. We actually just upgraded it, which kind of prompted me as well to look at this again and maybe improve the catalogue entry for it and expand it somewhat. The other thing that has kind of transformed our work quite a lot is the fact that we now have access to digital cameras. When I started working in museums, we very rarely had any pictures of objects in the collection because it was just too difficult for an amateur with an amateur camera to take anything that was in any way useful. And even if you did take pictures, you had nowhere to put them. So over lockdown, I suppose it was kind of an opportunity as well to pursue a few kind of passion projects. And this was one of the things that I started to look at. And the more I started to explore this prayer book, the more I realized that there was a lot more to it than simply, I suppose, the title of prison prayer book. And actually, it would appear that it's in some ways a record of that period as recorded by Countess Markievicz, because it was full of all these kind of inclusions, but also articles and photographs from newspapers pasted in. And I think it's really interesting how she, in some ways, transformed this prayer book into I suppose, a memorial to many of those who died during the Irish War of Independence. So I suppose, presuming anyway that many of you probably know a lot about Countess Markievicz. She's probably one of certainly the most famous women involved in the 1916 to 23 period and the struggle for independence in the 20th century. Just very briefly, she is born into a very privileged life in her family's estate in Lissadell in County Sligo. Her father is Sir Henry Gorbooth, and she, I suppose, is reared in this kind of Anglo-Irish country house family, but has quite an independent spirit. As a young woman, she decides that she wants to study art. She goes to London and then goes to Paris, where she studies art, and then also meets Count Casimir Markievicz, who's ethnically Polish, who grew up in what is now the Ukraine, and at the time was a subject of the Tsar of Russia. They marry, they return to Dublin, where he pursues his artistic career. They become involved in theatrical circles. Eventually, the marriage kind of fizzles out. In the meantime, she becomes involved in, I suppose, Irish nationalist women's organizations, but also in the socialist and trade union movement. She's very involved in the lockout in 1913. She's involved in the foundation of the Irish Citizens Army. During the 1916 Rising, she's second in command in St. Stephen's Green, and after the Rising is sentenced to be executed. And in many ways, in terms of the coverage of the Rising at the time, she's kind of, in many ways, the most prominent figure. Certainly in the initial reports, there's a lot of interest in the idea of this aristocratic woman who ends up rebelling against the Queen. Against the king. She has her death sentence commuted. She's sent to prison in England following the Rising and spends time in Aylesbury jail. Then she returns to Ireland. She's released, but then is rearrested in 1918. She's released again. She's also then stands for a seat in Parliament. And is elected, making her the first woman to ever be elected to Westminster. She doesn't take her seat, however. Herself and the rest of the Sinn Féin MPs, or TDs, as they describe themselves, they set up their own parliament in Dublin, the first Irish Dáil. She becomes Minister for Labour, making her one of the first female cabinet ministers. And then she subsequently becomes involved in the War of Independence. She's a very kind of prominent political figure. And is arrested, as we'll hear in this lecture, and spends time in Cork Gaol and Mountjoy Jail. Then during the Civil War, she takes the anti-treaty side and again finds herself in prison. And she dies very young in 1927. And as I suppose in many ways is a very prominent figure in Irish history, and I think for many years was often the only woman, female figure associated with that period that was, I suppose, popularly known. That of course has changed dramatically since then. And I just realized I have the wrong date there for her. She died in 1927, not 1916. But the thing we're going to talk about today, as I said, on the face of it, it is a prayer book. It's called the Augustinian Manual, written by an Augustinian prior of their priory in Kent, a man called Richard A. O'Gorman. And it's very kind of typical of material that was produced around that period. And you would have found kind of prayer books and other things like this all over, particularly in Ireland. You know, the country was awash with this kind of item. But as I said, this is produced specifically for the Augustinian community and those attending their services. And the way it comes to the museum here is again full of intrigue and drama. And I think probably Countess Markievicz would probably have really appreciated that, because she liked a bit of intrigue and drama. So apparently at some point in the in about 1961, it was given to a woman called Josephine O'Donoghue, who was married to a man called Major Florrie O'Donoghue. Now, Josephine, or Mary O'Donoghue, as she was generally known, she herself had a very interesting life. She was a typist based in Victoria Barracks in Cork, and was a spy for Michael Collins in Victoria Barracks, and has been the kind of inspiration for many of those kind of stories of these women who seemed innocuous to their employers in the British government, but were actually really significant sources of intelligence during the War of Independence. Florrie O'Donoghue, he was involved in, again, the independence struggle from the time of the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence. And during the Civil War, interestingly, he doesn't take either side. He tries to remain neutral and tries to, I suppose, bring both sides together. He later joins the Irish Army and is a very respected historian. So, sorry, and this is him in his younger days. So in a letter that we have that was sent by Florrie O'Donoghue to the secretary of the president then, the then president, Eamon de Valera, he wrote, "The prayer book was given to my wife about 2 years ago by," the name is not included, "who lives in Cork." He was rather vague and evasive as to how it came into his possession. All he would say was that it had been found in a drawer in some furniture which had been sent to an auction room in the city from a house in South Douglas Road. Efforts to have this confirmed have failed. He goes on to say, again, efforts to trace how it came into the possession of this mysterious person have failed. There is an unconfirmed suggestion that it was found in a raid during the Civil War period, which in many ways would explain why there's all this mystery about the original source of the prayer book back in the 1960s. And he had passed it on to President de Valera to be presented to Kilmainham Gaol. He also mentions that his wife consulted Nora Wallace, who was a friend of Countess Markievicz. Nora Wallace and her sister had a shop on Augustinian Street, just off Main Street in Cork. And the Wallace sisters are themselves amazing women. There was a very interesting documentary done about, a radio documentary done about them, and there's been lots of articles written about what they did during the War of Independence in terms of hiding guns and men in their shop. Their shop was in many ways kind of an intelligence center during the Troubles. And interestingly, in terms of the prayer book, they were located just around the corner from the Augustinian Church in Cork, which is one of the major religious institutions in the city. So Florrie O'Donoghue's wife, Mary, had gone to her as a friend of Countess Markievicz when this prayer book had been given to her to get her take on it, I suppose. And Nora Wallace describes herself in a memo she wrote in 1963 about the prayer book as Nora Wallace, Irish Citizens Army, who had charge of Countess Markievicz during her 4 months imprisonment in Cork Gaol. And she writes then that, "I have no doubt the Augustinian Manual belonged to the Countess. The name is definitely in her writing. The inscription on it puzzled me, as that wording too seemed familiar. After some time and a lot of thought, I remembered the manual was given to me and the writing on it was the same. As far as I can remember, these books were not on sale and were obtainable only at the Augustinian Priory, and it is quite possible the same donor gave me one for Madame, but I have no recollection of this. Obviously, she had it in Cork Gaol because she signed it." And Countess Markievicz herself, in a letter to Kathleen Clarke, wrote in July of 1919, when she was in Cork Gaol, "Two dear old monks with white beards came to see me. They were exactly alike and had great fun puzzling me. I knew one of them before. No one ever knows them apart, and they never stop laughing about it." Now, they Florrie O'Donoghue gave this prayer book to President Eamon de Valera, who of course had been a prisoner in Kilmainham Gaol in 1916 and during the Civil War. And a lot of material in the collection from that period came via Eamon de Valera himself. So people would give it to the president and he would then present it to the Kilmainham Gaol Restoration Society, who had restored the building and had created the collection. And you can see him here in 1966 at the official ceremony to mark the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising in Stonebreaker's Yard, where the 1916 leaders were executed. But also, he, as I said, was a great kind of supporter of this enterprise. So the prayer book itself, I suppose the earliest entry in it is a signature by Countess Markievicz. She was in Cork City Jail from June to October 1919, and she has signed it there. And also she's given her address as 30 Richmond Road, Fairview. This is 30 Richmond Avenue, Fairview, which was the home of Kathleen Clarke, the widow of Thomas Clarke, one of the main leaders of the 1916 Rising. They had been prisoners together in Holloway Prison in 1918, where they had an interest, a close but often kind of fractious relationship with one another. But they became very, very firm friends and very kind of devoted friends. And interestingly, and again, this might be significant in terms of what happened to the prayer book afterwards. After the 1916 Rising, Countess Markievicz gave up the house she was renting, Surrey House in Rathgar. She never really had her own home after that date. After that, she was largely living with friends until she died in 1927. So at that time, then she was based in Richmond Avenue in Fairview, and that's where her possessions were. And a lot of her letters to Kathleen Clarke relate to, you know, things that she wants from her room, and also what to do with her possessions, which are also kind of scattered around the city. And you can see them there together at the treaty debates in 1922, along with Kate O'Callaghan, who's the widow of the Mayor of Cork, who was killed during the War of Independence, and at the very end then Mrs. Pearce, mother of Patrick and William Pearce. So Countess Markievicz, in 1919, I think she, I think sometimes we don't realize just what a big name she would have been at that time. She's still, you know, something of a novelty as well, to have such a prominent woman in a position of power. But she's in great demand in terms of meetings, and she is arrested in Dublin. She's arrested in the Clarke home in Fairview in relation to a speech she gave in Newmarket in County Limerick. And they decide to send her down to prison in Cork, and she's sent to the city jail in Cork. There's also a county jail in Cork, but she's sent to the city jail in Cork, which is where she is when she receives this this prayer book. And interestingly, this is where you start to see references in her letters to Nora Wallace. So Mrs. Mina O'Hegarty, who's married to the scholar P.S. O'Hegarty, and Nora Wallace visited me on Saturday. They brought me strawberries and other nice things. I do hope you are none the worse for the excitement and worry. I feel guilty for bringing trouble on the house, though I know you wouldn't wish it otherwise, you great soul. So she's referring to all the, I suppose, the fuss and the hullabaloo around her her arrest in Fairview, and then she has to be transported through the city to what's now Euston Station to bring her down to prison in Cork. And again, one of the things actually I should mention as well, again, just to add to the layer of mystery around the object, when Florrie O'Donoghue donated the prayer book to Kilmainham Gaol Museum, to the Kilmainham Gaol Restoration Society, rather, back in 1963, he said it was to be donated in the name of Nora Wallace, who, as we've heard, didn't own the prayer book and didn't necessarily have a huge connection with it, other than the fact that she was, I suppose, Countess Markievicz's connection in 1919, and she was looking after her. Again, there's a letter to Nora Connolly James Connolly's daughter and a friend of the Countess's. Miss McSweeney, so that's Terence McSweeney's sister Mary, and Miss Wallace will arrange about visits. So if anyone is going down here, let them send a car ahead, so that will be a visit to spare. So again, Nora Wallace is clearly the person in charge of the Countess while she's in prison down there on behalf of the Citizens' Army, or I suppose the independence movement. So the other things in terms of like this period and the presentation of this prayer book to the Countess, there is this inscription which is hidden by a later edition. With kindest wishes to me who has suffered, may you always be well and happy, from a friend. So again, we don't quite know, but again, it would seem maybe it was somebody connected with the Augustinian community in Cork. And you can see it there just a little bit closer. So the prayer book then, the Countess is released from Cork in October of 1919, but just under a year later, she's arrested again here in Dublin on the 26th of September, and she's imprisoned in C Wing of Mountjoy Jail. This is not C Wing, but it is a very nice painting of Mountjoy Prison by Alf McLaughlin, who was a nephew of Patrick Pearse's. If you look then in the prayer book, she's arrested on the 26th of September, and then in the prayer book is written Mountjoy Jail, September 27th, 1920. So this is, I suppose, the prayer book being taken up again. So it would seem maybe she had it with her when she was arrested or was sent in to her, but she seems to have had it very quickly once she went into Mountjoy. This is also really important as well, as you'll see, because it kind of confirms that she has this prayer book with her in Mountjoy. Now, I suspect that Countess Markievicz was in the female prison, so hopefully you can see my little arrow there. So the bigger complex is the male prison, that's Mountjoy as we know it today, but there's also a female prison, and I suspect that that's where she is. We do know definitely that the female political prisoners were kept separate to the men, though the women, as we'll see also, challenged the separation on occasions and made contact with the male prisoners. And once she goes into Mountjoy, I think you start to see the transformation of this prayer book then from being simply a prayer book into her way of recording the events and memorializing those, particularly those who have died or have been killed during the conflict. The earliest event that we see is this poem to Sean, written by a woman called Alice French. And you can see here, this is Sean Tracy, who's from Tipperary. He's involved in the first, I suppose, event of the War of Independence, the first shots of the War of Independence back in January 1919, the ambush at Solo Head Beg. And, you know, that is really what's kind of the event that really begins the War of Independence. He is killed in an ambush on Talbot Street in Dublin city centre, coming out of a meeting with his comrades in the IRA. And this is a poem memorializing him. And then just a quick plug, we did actually do a special exhibit all about Sean Tracy back in 2020 to mark the anniversary of his killing. Again, we have some really significant items related to him, including the shoe, one of the shoes he was wearing the day he was shot. Now, as I said, this is the beginning of the pasting of these items into the prayer book. Now, in the 60s, Nora Wallace is kind of a bit surprised by this. So she writes in this memorandum about the prayer book, I find it hard to believe that Madame would glue newspaper cuttings to her prayer book, and I'm inclined to think that this was done in Cork. That these cuttings refer to Terry McSweeney confirms this. Interestingly, Terence McSweeney seems to have worked for a period in the shop owned by the Wallace sisters. Now, I think in some ways Nora Wallace maybe doesn't have a sense maybe of Countess Markievicz's religious belief. Countess Markievicz converts to Catholicism following the 1916 rising, but I think in some ways it can be seen as an act of solidarity with the I suppose the revolutionary movement, which is kind of very much influenced by Catholic culture. I think she's attracted to Catholicism on a spiritual level. She talks about having a spiritual experience while a prisoner after the rising, and that this kind of led her to finally convert. Also, it's also kind of a very kind of radical act by an Anglican woman, a member of the Church of Ireland, to convert to Catholicism in Ireland at the time. But one of the things I think is really interesting is this note, or this letter, that Father McMahon, who was the chaplain in Mountjoy after the 1916 rising, who was dealing, I suppose, with her conversion. He writes, "She wants to be received into the church, but she won't attend to me when I try to explain transubstantiation and other doctrines. She just says, 'Please don't trouble to explain. I tell you, I believe all the church teaches. Now, Father, please tell me about the boys.'" So she wants to know about the boys, about her. Countess Markievicz was very a leading figure in the setting up of Na Fianna, which was, I suppose, the youth movement for boys, and that's really where I think her heart lay in terms of the revolutionary movement, was with Na Fianna. She was also involved in the Citizens' Army and Coming on, but I think Na Fianna had first call on her heart. But in terms of her conversion, it's not a conversion. She's not Cardinal Newman. She hasn't been drawn to Catholicism through, I suppose, the study of its doctrines and that kind of thing. It's very much bound up in her political beliefs and her political ideas. And I think that those two are just kind of completely entwined and intermeshed, and you can't really pick them apart. And I think, as we'll see, this prayer book is not simply a scrapbook. It is actually an act of devotion, and it's an act of devotion which is very much influenced by that kind of mix of politics and religion. And also, the Countess Markievicz, if nothing else, tended to go her own way. And again, she wasn't kind of brought up with the kind of very strict, pious, devotional Catholicism that I suppose those born into the Catholic Church would have had in the 19th and early 20th century in Ireland. So she also, on occasion, is writing in names and recording dates of those who've died. So she also records Michael Fitzgerald, who died on hunger strike on the 16th of October 1920, and Joseph Murphy, who died on the 25th of October 1920. Both of them died in Cork County Jail. So this is a different jail than Cork City Jail, where she has been held in 1919. And I suppose what's really interesting is Michael Fitzgerald is the person who starts the hunger strike, which leads to the death of Terence McSweeney. But in some ways, his death, because Terence McSweeney was the mayor of Cork, he succeeded Thomas McCurtain, who had also been mayor of Cork, who had been killed by British forces. So in some ways, that story became a kind of an international story. And also, of course, Terence McSweeney, he had been transferred to England, and he died in Brixton Prison in London. So again, it had a bigger impact. And in some ways, the other men who were on hunger strike in Cork who also died are very much kind of overshadowed by him in terms of popular memory. But what's interesting, I think, as well from this prayer book is it seems at the time they were also kind of overshadowed as well. So this is Michael Fitzgerald, who's very much involved in the trade union movement. He's from Moy, and Joseph Murphy, was born in the United States but grows up in Cork. But as I said, the big story of October 1920 really is the story of Terence McSweeney, who died in October 1920, and his, I suppose, the manner in which he met his fate, and his willingness to sacrifice himself for the cause of Irish independence had a big effect on people at the time, and Countess Markievicz as well. She wrote a letter, I think, to Joseph McGarrity, just talking about, I suppose, how inspirational she found the McSweeney's death, and him as a person. And again, this kind of mixture of kind of the spiritual and religious and political is again something I think that would have appealed to her, but also appealed to Irish society at the time. And in fairness to Nora Wallace, there are quite a lot of references to Terence McSweeney in this prayer book. Just he's not the only one, but you can see there's that this reference here to the Dark Rosaleen, and talking about some of his last words written in Irish. Terence McSweeney was a big enthusiast for the Irish language, and again, one of this poem here by a person called W. Hope, again, something that this is actually not pasted in. It's just kept in the kept in the prayer book. There's also another clipping, and again, this isn't pasted in. This is a clipping that's been preserved in the prayer book, and it's about. You can see there this reference to this tribute that's held in New York, and again emphasizing how the death of Terence McSweeney on hunger strike was a huge story. And I suppose the other thing as well about hunger strikes is because they go on for a long time, it builds up interest over days as people are kind of watching and waiting to hear the fate of the person on hunger strike. The next then, I suppose, one of the next major events then is the execution of Kevin Barry, and again one of the big stories of the Irish War of Independence. I suppose he's immortalised in the ballad of Kevin Barry. But also he's the first person to be executed since the leaders of the 1916 Rising. This is a bust of him from our exhibition. And you can see there the schoolboy who died. He was actually a university student at the time, but he was, as the song said, a boy of 18 summers, and a medical student at the time. He was supposed to be sitting his resits at the time of the ambush in which he was captured. But his story, this first execution, really captured the public imagination and captured the imagination of Countess Markievicz as well. And she actually wrote a poem about him in her letters to her sister, Eva Gore-Booth, who was a very kind of serious poet. The Countess is referring to her own poems, but she says, "Oh well, my poems, it's just doggerel." And she says, there's a degree of talent involved in this poem, but it's very much a poem for recitation. It's not the kind of, I suppose, it's not the kind of sophisticated work that her sister was doing, and the Countess was the first person to admit that her writings were very much kind of had a political aim rather than anything else. Now, he was executed in Mountjoy prison. She would have been in Mountjoy prison at the time, albeit in a separate area, but she certainly was in the complex at the time. And I suppose one of the things that is hard to gauge, because her letters from that period are kind of a little bit sporadic. She wrote very regularly to her sister Eva, but there's definite gaps there, and there's also a definite sense that there are letters that haven't survived or certainly aren't known about now. But what is not clear is how aware she was. But one of the things, like, you definitely get a sense in the writings of people like Oscar Wilde and Brendan Behan, is that when there was an execution in a prison, the whole institution felt it, and that was staff and prisoners. The other thing in this just above this that reference we were looking at earlier for Terence McSweeney, is there's a reference to a special memorial service being held in St Andrew's Church on Westland Row by a Reverend W. Landers, and it's for Kevin Barry, Terence McSweeney, Michael Fitzgerald, Joseph Murphy, who we've heard of, Sean Tracy, who we've heard of, but also William Connell and Sean Doyle, all of whom have recently died in the fight for Ireland. And what's again interesting is there's some well-known names there, but others who are not that well known then and or now, to be honest. So William O'Connell, he was killed in an ambush. He was involved in an ambush of British forces in Phibsborough, and he was killed during that ambush on the 14th of October, 1920. And then Sean Doyle, he was killed up in the Dublin Mountains in Kilmainham. He was in. He was actually from Inchicore, not far from where I am talking to you this evening in Kilmainham Jail. He was a member of Na Fianna. Again, there may have been a connection with Countess Markievicz through that. I'm not sure. His father also fought in the 1916 Rising, and he was part of he was part of the engineers section of the IRA, and they were up in Kilmainham. They were testing out explosives. Apparently, the British Army got wind of this and ambushed them up there. The British Army actually had been camping in St. Columba's College nearby, and it would seem that the head of the ambush party, and a British officer called Dudley, claimed that he was shot when he was attempting to take out his gun to fire on them, but in fact it would seem that he was shot on the ground while trying to surrender. And again, as you can see from his the image of his funeral here, it was a big story at that time. Interestingly, he's one of two men called Sean Doyle killed in Dublin during the War of Independence. So again, you have these two names there as well. Now, Countess Markievicz is also in prison in Mountjoy, just down from Croke Park. So she is in Croke Park when Bloody Sunday takes place in November, the 21st of November, 1920. And she said to Ava, "You're quite right when you say things are lurid here. The Croke Park affair lasted 40 minutes by my watch, and there were machine guns going. It felt like being back in the middle of Easter week. Croke Park is quite close." So, as I'm sure most of you know, this is Bloody Sunday when British forces entered Croke Park and fired essentially on the crowd, leading to the resulting in the death of 14 people. And this was in response to an operation carried out by Michael Collins' squad of the IRA, where his agents went around Dublin on the morning of the 21st of November and shot and killed a number of British agents and two auxiliary policemen in Dublin. And this was to have repercussions both in terms of Bloody Sunday, but for months to come. Because in the prayer book as well, we also have two images of Dick McKee and Peadar Clancy, two senior members of the IRA at the time based in Dublin. They had been arrested the previous Saturday, the Saturday before Bloody Sunday, and were in British custody in Dublin Castle. And it would seem that they were shot probably in the early hours of Monday morning after Bloody Sunday in reprisal for the events of the morning of Bloody Sunday. They were actually shot along with a third man, Conor Clune, who was from County Clare. Conor Clune, it would seem it was a case of kind of the wrong place at the wrong time for him. He was arrested in the mistaken belief that he was arrested in a hotel that had been frequented by the IRA, and it was again a case of mistaken identity. But all three men were shot illegally on that Monday morning. So again, another big story at the time, and something again reflected in the Countess's prayer book. And again, another plug, also the subject of a display we did over lockdown, looking at the story of these three men and their killing in 1920. Countess Markievicz, as I said, she was arrested on the 26th of September. She was held in Mountjoy. Her trial didn't take place until the beginning of December 1920. And again, it's really interesting. This is a quote from her trial. This is her concluding words. She said, "The voice of the dead carries to the four ends of the earth, and the spiritual forces and the noble words of our martyrs will overwhelm you and bring us freedom in the end. This is all I have to say." And again, it's just really interesting how kind of the political and the religious are completely bound up for her. And I'm just going to quote now from Laura Arrington, who's written a biography of Countess Markievicz and her husband Casimir. She writes that in terms of the Countess Markievicz, I suppose, her state of mind at the time, the deaths of friends and political comrades had a profound effect on her Markievicz's psyche. During her imprisonments, she reflected on these losses, and the one way of combating depression was to focus on spiritual redemption. And as I said, that this is why I feel that when Nora Wallace thinks it's somehow that you know, that the idea that the Countess would place these things into this book, it was somehow kind of something that wasn't kind of religiously correct. As I said, I think for the Countess, this prayer book is an act of devotion. This is her religion. This is and her religious and political life, as I said, are essentially the same at this point. Now, the next thing I'm just going to talk about in relation to the prayer book, in terms of the chronology, is a little bit of speculation. There's this note. It's a free note, an inclusion rather. It's not pasted in. And it says, "Mrs. Dick hopes you will accept this little token in memory of the roses and that you will soon be free. She and the other Mrs. D remember you every day. Signed, Dick." Now, the only person I can think of so far that's the only Dick that I can think of is actually Richard Mulcahy, which again makes this rather remarkable, given that he ultimately becomes one of the leaders of the Free State during the Civil War, and I suppose in many ways kind of an enemy of the Countess. He had recently married Min Ryan. She and her sisters were kind of very much involved in the independence movement. Min Ryan had actually been engaged to Sean McDermott, one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising. And one of the suggestions for maybe the second Mrs. D might be Geraldine Dillon, who was a sister of Joseph Plunkett. Because we talked to Lindy Naughton, who's a biographer of Countess Markievicz, and when we were talking about it, this was one of her suggestions. So again, this is something that, again, we need to follow up in terms of further research on this remarkable item. So I suppose we return now to where we were earlier in terms of the executions in Mountjoy on the 14th of March 1921. Two men, Patrick Moran and Thomas Whelan, both involved in the independence struggle, both accused of being responsible for some of the killings of British agents on the morning of Bloody Sunday back in November 1920, both of whom denied involvement in terms of the crimes that they were convicted of, though Patrick Moran, probably one of the, I suppose, it would seem that he couldn't have been responsible for killing the agent he's accused of killing, a guy called Ames, because he was involved in another operation on Bloody Sunday involving the death of a British agent, but not the one he was accused of. But anyway, they were both convicted in, I think, very kind of in a very dubious process. And were sentenced to be executed. And there were 6 men executed on the 14th of March, but they're generally seen as being in 2 groups. And they're the first group. They're executed at 6 a.m. On the 14th of March. And it would seem that Countess Markievicz was able to make contact with them, or somebody made contact with them on her behalf, because the prayer book contains these two notes from them written the night before their execution. So this is Patrick Moran's. He was from Crossing in County Roscommon and had been a prisoner here in Kilmainham Jail as well previous to this, and Thomas Whelan, who was from Clifton in Connemara. And you can see here, he said, "I loved Ireland and you," so suggesting maybe that he had met Countess Markievicz, or maybe there was a closer relationship than just providing or sending this note. There's also reference as well to to Frank Flood and Thomas Bryan, who were executed later that morning. And you can see here they're here along with a poem called Calvary, written by a woman called Eileen de Puer, who's from Lancashire, you would see. And they were involved in the Drumcondra ambush on Drumcondra Bridge, now Frank Flood Bridge, and were arrested along with two of their comrades, Patrick Doyle and Bernard Ryan, who were sentenced to be executed. And they were also executed on the 14th of March. Another man, Dermot O'Sullivan, who was only 17, he was arrested. He is also included in the prayer book because it was believed he was going to be executed at that time, but he was actually, his sentence was commuted due to his youth. There's also a poem at the very beginning written by the poet Alice Furlong called The Gallows Tree, and again this would seem to refer to them. She makes reference to the gallows tree on the Liffey tide, so it's set in Dublin, and the reason I think it might be about the 14th of March is the reference to blossoms 3 and 3. So 3 and 3 making 6. So I think that's what the poem is alluding to. Now, later on the 14th of March, you had those, in the early hours of the morning, you had the executions at 6, 7 and 8 a.m. Then that evening, there was an ambush on Brunswick Street, now Pearse Street, of some British forces attacked there was an ambush by British forces, and a number of IRA men were killed, including this young man, Leo Fitzgerald, and he was actually quite close to Countess Markievicz. He was a member of Na Fianna. He was actually from Great Brunswick Street himself, just further down the street. And Nora Wallace writes, "A personal friend of Madame's. I remember being in his house in Dublin with Madame, and she held the family in affection and esteem." Now, Nora Wallace makes reference to a mortuary card being in the prayer book, but I think actually she's confused. What she's actually referring to is this. And again, I think it's kind of interesting, because in some ways it looks like a mortuary card, both because the image is that kind of mortuary card size, but also I think kind of devotional quality of this pasting of this image into the prayer book has given that kind of sense of a memorial. And Countess Markievicz was very, as I said, close to that family, probably closer to, it would seem, to Leo's brother, who's called Theobald Wolfe-Tone Fitzgerald. This is a picture of Theobald with a guy called Thomas MacDonald from Waterford, and the Countess and Poppet, the black spaniel owned by Countess Markievicz. And in her letters, actually, she makes lots of reference to Theo in particular when she's talking to Kathleen Clarke about cleaning some of her rugs that might need cleaning. She says to get Theo to come and give her a hand. So she seemed to have, within the Fianna, there were certain boys whom she was particularly close to, who she almost kind of took under her wing. So, as I said, this would have been something kind of devastating news for the Countess to learn of the death of this young man who she would have known as a boy in Na Fianna. And as I said, close to the whole Fitzgerald family, it would seem. Now, during that ambush on Brunswick Street, Thomas Traynor, who was involved in the independence movement, but kind of, I suppose, it's always at that stage was he was the father of a large family. He was a shoemaker. He was captured and he had a gun on him. Now he claimed he wasn't involved in the ambush; that he was actually bringing it to IRA headquarters. But he was sentenced to be executed, and he was executed in Mountjoy Jail on the 25th of April, 1921. And then there are further two final executions in Mountjoy, Patrick Marr and Edmund Foley. They're executed in relation to the rescue of Sean Hogan. Sean Hogan was involved in that first event of the War of Independence with Sean Tracy and Dan Breen in Solohead Beg. He was being transported under escort, and there was an attack in Knockalong Station. And these two men were arrested, and again they said that they weren't actually involved, and there were numerous attempts to convict them, and in the civil court that didn't work, so they were eventually handed over to the British military for a court-martial, and then they were executed on the 7th of June 1921. And all of these executions then are recorded in the and details of some very kind of brief details, and their ages are recorded in the prayer book. There are also a number of other people. Patrick Thomas O'Reilly himself and his brother Stephen were both killed during the attack on the Customs House in May of 1921. This is him here. There's also in memoriam notice for Sean McDermott, who was executed in Kilmainham Jail in 1916, and there's also reference to Thomas Clarke, who's his great friend, and in many ways the two of them are the real power behind the 1916 Rising. There's a poem by Eamon de Valera related to his period as he was under sentence of execution after the Rising in Richmond Barracks. There's also this news clipping about de Valera. He talking about him evading capture, and also one announcing that Kathleen Clarke, Thomas Clarke's widow, who'd been elected an alderman of Dublin Corporation, had been appointed president of the Court of Conscience, which was a court which heard issues around debt and dealt with kind of debt. It was kind of a very minor court, a kind of a holdover really from the Middle Ages, and was kind of coming to the end of its life when she was appointed. But she was the first woman to be appointed. This is the chain of office of the president of the Court of Conscience. And then, as I said, it was abolished shortly afterwards, after many centuries. But interestingly, when she became the first female Lord Mayor of Dublin, she refused to wear the Lord Mayor's chain because it had an image of William of Orange on it, and she wore the old chain of the President of the Court of Conscience, their chain of office, instead. And this is it on display in an exhibition recently in Dublin Castle. Then there are other inclusions, but again, I suppose before I move off those articles about de Valera and Kathleen Clarke, what I think is really interesting is, again, in terms of this prayer book being an act of devotion, not everything is pasted in. And I think it's really interesting that those kind of more newsy things aren't. The things that are pasted in are related directly to the memory of the dead. But there are a number of kind of prayers as well. This one has a little note, presumably written by the Countess in the back. There's this poem written by Sir William Watson, a now forgotten figure, really. At the time, a really big poet. He was suggested on many occasions to be poet laureate. He was knighted, but he also had took a very independent stance politically. He was critical of the British involvement in the Boer War, and as you can see in England's choice, is supportive of the Irish struggle for independence, and definitely sees Ireland as the injured party in the conflict. Then more kind of the kind of thing maybe that you'd expect to find in a prayer book, a litany of the Irish saints. So if you need to know who the patron saint of Killaloe is, you can find out it's Saint Flannan. And also this is a kind of French one. I think I actually made a mistake earlier. I had the wrong image for the front of the Thomas Whelan note, but this is a kind of a French produced prayer card, again very common at the time. leaflet in relation to the miraculous medal, which again was hugely popular in the 1920s and into, I suppose, still very popular item. And the other thing I thought was really interesting is there's also the remnants of a flower or a leaf or a plant. And interestingly, when Countess Markievicz was in Mountjoy, her work involved gardening. She was working in the prison garden. She created a rockery, apparently, in the prison garden. But she was a very keen gardener herself. So you can see her here in the garden. And earlier in the century, when Inine Nahairn, one of the first female revolutionary movements in Ireland, they had their own newspaper called Ban Nahairn, and she wrote a political gardening column for Ban Nahairn, in which she compared getting rid of pests, slugs and other pests to ridding Ireland of British influence. While she was in Mountjoy, there weren't very many women arrested during the War of Independence, certainly compared to the Civil War, but there were a number. Among them, the woman in the middle there is Ethna Coyle, later Ethna O'Donnell, and she's shown here. The other woman there with the on the very, I suppose, on the far right is Linda Kearns. They're hiding here in Duckett's Grove in Carlow after they've escaped from Mountjoy. But Ethna Coyle said that they escaped in October, but Countess Markievicz was released much earlier in the summer as part of the truce arrangements, because obviously she was part of the government at the time. But before she left, she gave Ethna Coyle this spoon. So I suppose kind of very symbolic as well from Countess Markievicz, the aristocrat's daughter, a silver spoon. But Ethna Coyle kept this as a souvenir of her time in prison. And also she gives an interesting insight. She said that it was while I was in Mountjoy that Paddy Moran and the other 5 lads were executed. I remember that during exercise one day, I ran away from the wardress and went over to the enclosure to wave at them. Thomas Trainor's execution also caused us great grief. So again, it's interesting that it seems that there is some kind of awareness. There's definitely awareness that these men are in the prison, and there is forms of communication going on. So the prayer book then continues, I think, in the Countess's possession. In the early stages of the Civil War, she has mortuary cards produced in memory of these 4 men, for the most prominent executions in 1922: Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Richard Barrett, and Joseph McKelvey, all really senior members in the independence movement. And they are executed in retaliation for the killing of Sean Hales, a Free State TD. And this is a really shocking event at the time, because they are so prominent. And famously, Kevin O'Higgins, who kind of signed the order, Rory O'Connor had been his best man. And just earlier that year, in June 1922, at Wolfetone's graveyard, at the grave in Bodenstown in County Kildare, at the traditional oration, Liam Mellows gave it, and you can see Countess Markievicz there at this oration. And here she is again, and she's accompanied by Oscar Traynor and Rory O'Connor. So this is just a few months before their execution. And again, another kind of shocking fatality on the Republican side during the Civil War, Harry Boland. And clearly she is, I suppose at this stage, she's doing what a lot of people do with mortuary cards, is put it in their prayer book, again, as a way of keeping these things safe, but also maybe remembering the dead. So, sorry, I suppose, again, I presume at some point then, if Florrie O'Donoghue's theory is correct, maybe when the Countess is arrested, or one of her homes is raided, or maybe a house in which she has kept her possessions is raided, that this prayer book comes into the hands of somebody maybe from the opposite side in the Civil War, because there doesn't seem to be anything else after this date. There's one last thing that I wanted to have a look at, and again, it's, I suppose, trying to give an insight into what we do in terms of looking after museum collections. There's also a photograph, and when we saw this photograph, interestingly, we didn't recognize the woman, but we recognized the dog. This is the famous Poppet, or Mr. P. One of the best stories about him is apparently Countess Markievicz had him at the time of the 1916 Rising, and he was brought when she was being transported from Dublin across to prison as she was going to Aylesbury Jail in England, and he was brought down to what was then Kingstown, now Dunleary, and when he saw her, he got free and jumped onto the boat. So Poppet was brought with the Countess across the Irish Sea to prison, and I think, as far as I remember, Eva Gore-Booth had to kind of meet the boat in Holyhead and take Poppet to safety. So he is, and we saw him earlier again, and he is the dog that went to prison for Irish freedom. But as I said, the woman we didn't know, nor did Nora Wallace. She said, "The lady in the snap I do not know, but I do know that a photograph of Madame's dog was sent to me to give to Madame. The receipt of it gave her real pleasure, as she told me a hand in the picture was that of Orr Barton, who was on the run at the time." That's Robert Barton, who was from, again, a very wealthy background. His family owned a very successful winery in France, and he lived in Glendalough House and was a double cousin of Erskine Childers. And it would seem, we were kind of looking at it. At one stage, we thought it might have been Esther Roper, who was Eva Gore-Booth's partner, but eventually kind of dawned on us that it might have been Dulcibella Barton, who was Robert Barton's sister, who was living in Glendalough, in the family seat in Glendalough House at the time. And in her witness statement, she said, whenever Con Markievicz went to jail, her dog, a brown spaniel, always came to me. And there are numerous references then when you start to look and kind of put everything together in Countess Markievicz's prison letters to Dulcibella as the person who is looking after Poppet for her. So then that all started to make sense. And then one of the other indications for me was actually the window here behind her. So this is Glendalough House. Now, a big chunk of the east wing apparently was demolished in the 1970s, but I think you can see there the windows, they're very kind of similar to the ones that survive in Glendalough House today. And you can see a big bit of granite as well, which is a sure sign that you're in Wicklow, I think. These big kind of big pieces of carved granite dotted about the place. So Dulcibella Barton, again, a really interesting figure herself. She is involved in hiding men and arms during the War of Independence, and the house is raided during the War of Independence and the Civil War. And interestingly, in her witness statement, as she said, she talks about looking after Poppet. She also talks about the Countess kind of handed over a young boy who again she'd taken under her wing, and kind of slightly disturbingly she referred to as one of the Countess's pets. But I think again one of these young boys that she'd kind of taken a shine to, and that she had tried to look after and I suppose help out a little bit. So she also ended up looking after him after the 1916 Rising. But they had a very, very close friendship. And again, I suppose it's really exciting when you make this connection, when you're finally able to identify a photograph, because to a certain extent, we don't know who a person is. A photograph has very limited use in terms of our understanding of the past. Again, as I said, there's lots of references to Glendalough House, and she's often writing about what a beautiful place it is. And as I said, the house played a key part in identifying the image for me anyway. But the other exciting thing is this is a photograph from the collection in the Pearse Museum, which I've had for years. And I've always wondered who this second woman is, they're clearly in some kind of a garden. And I think it is also Dulcibella Barton. So this is a really big discovery. The two photographs kind of unlocked at the same time. You can see them there side by side. And again, it ties in with what we hear about Dulcibella in Countess Markievicz's letters when she's in prison in Holloway in 1918. There's frequent references to the fact that she has sent vegetables across to Countess Markievicz, so clearly a keen gardener, which ties in, as I said, with this image of her with the Countess in a garden.